So, Your Holiness, dear colleagues, Buddhist scholars, friends, good morning. Today we have two talks in the morning session. Your Holiness, the first talk will be by your new friend, Professor Dubrovsky. He is Chief Research Fellow at the Institute of Philosophy, and he is also a professor of philosophy at Moscow State University. His main interests are in the theory of consciousness, relation of mind and body, and also methodology of science. He is the author then more of 300 papers in this field and also of 7 books on consciousness, mind-brain problem, and also artificial intelligence. Professor Dubrovsky.
Your Holiness, excuse me, please. I know English very bad, but I have some kind helper, and if you don't mind. My report will read my friend Dmitry Volkov. Thank you very much.
Очень хорошо.
Prospects of neuroscientific approaches to the problem of consciousness in connection with the growing global crisis of terrestrial civilization. Getting prepared for our meeting, I carefully studied the works of Your Holiness, which impressed me with depth of humanistic thought and extraordinary sincerity, belief in benevolent creative possibilities of the mind, and spiritual powers of mankind. The system of universal ethics developed by you, which is based on altruistic properties inherent in human nature, is becoming of a particular importance now. Our consumer civilization is experiencing a global crisis that is steadily deepening, leading to degradation and destruction. This is constantly discussed. But on the part of the world's political and economic leaders, we do not see any decisive opposition. Now, more than ever before in the history of mankind, the preservation of faith in human dignity, in courage and strength of spirit, in the belief in the altruistic potential of human nature is urgently needed. The issue of consciousness is a key point in overcoming the global crisis of terrestrial civilization. We are in desperate need for the fundamental change in human consciousness. These goals are served by the system of ethics. The system contains a developed toolkit for self-knowledge and self-improvement, education of high moral values for overcoming negative properties of consciousness, such as irrepressible consumerism, aggressiveness, and extreme egoism. They too are rooted in human nature, and this determines their persistence, immutability at all stages of human history. To overcome them, not only new ideas and effective educational tools are needed. We need thorough scientific research of consciousness and the use of its results. Today, as Dalai Lama observes, science as a whole, and especially neuroscience, is increasingly becoming interested in questions of consciousness. This gives me optimism. The Dalai Lama also speaks about the important role of neuroscience in other parts of his book. Indeed, in recent decades, neuroscience has achieved significant results in the study of consciousness. They are associated in particular with the use of methods for visualizing brain processes and the removal of signals from individual neurons, discovery and study of mirror neurons, the successful development of the trend called brain reading, with the determination of clear neurodynamic correlates of many psychic phenomena that serve as a foundation for neurotechnologies in medicine and for other practical purposes. Neuroscientific development of the problem of consciousness is interdisciplinary. But the most important part belongs, of course, to those disciplines of the psychological, phenomenological, and humanitarian plan that describe consciousness, its meaningful dynamic forms, value and semantics, and active and volitional structures. Without such definite description, it is impossible to conduct a neuroscientific study and to explain consciousness. Numerous theoretical and methodological questions arise here, on the solution of which the productivity of all the scientific work depends. First of all, it is necessary to solve most difficult theoretical problem about the nature of connection between the phenomena of consciousness and brain processes. The problem is that the phenomena of consciousness is described in terms of content, meaning, purpose, faith, will, while brain processes in terms of nerve substrate and pulse, mass, energy, and spatial properties. These are two different description languages, and there are no direct logical connection between them. In analytical philosophy, they say there is an explanatory gap here. In order to relate these two types of descriptions, it is necessary to create a conceptual bridge to create such a theoretical system that would be logically relevant to each of the different ways of describing and could link them in a single theoretical explanation. This issue has always been a stumbling block for natural sciences. Meanwhile, subjective reality is a necessary and specific property of consciousness. Without it, there is no consciousness. Neuroscientific research and explanation of this quality compose the essence of what many philosophers called the hard problem of consciousness. For more than 50 years, it has been the focus of analytic philosophy. Despite the huge amount of publications, no acceptable result has been achieved in the development. It was noted by both Western and Russian philosophers and representatives of neuroscience. The proposed concepts were in general reductionist, thus the specificity of subjective reality was lost. In fact, to solve the problem, it is necessary to give a theoretical correct answer to one main question. How is mental, the phenomenon of subjective reality, connected with the brain process? This will help to explain the mental causality, arbitrary action, the phenomenon of free will, and a number of other difficult questions. Trying to solve the problem, for many years I have been developing an informational approach based on the ideas of evolution and self-organization. The basic thesis of the theory developed by me were expounded in doctoral dissertation, which was subsequently published in a book in 1971. The theory I proposed is different from the existing concepts of analytical philosophy. It relies on three initial premises from which answers to the main questions of the problem are logically derived. The first two premises are generally accepted scientific principles. И он просто переводит. The first two premises are generally accepted scientific principles, and the third premise is intuitively acceptable agreement, will be well confirmed by ordinary and scientific experience. I give them below. Information necessary embodied in physical barrier. Second, information is invariant to the physical properties of its bearer. So the same information can be implemented and transferred by bearers that are different in their physical properties. In other words, the same information can be coded in different ways. Thirdly, a phenomenon of subjective reality can be regarded as information. Since the phenomenon of subjective reality is information about the subject, it has its own specific barrier. We will designate it as X, which according to neuroscience is a certain brain neurodynamic system. Thus the phenomenon of subjective reality is necessarily connected with the corresponding brain process like any information in its barrier. Analysis shows that the relation between A and X is not causal. This is a special kind of functional connection. A and X are simultaneous and based on one cause. They are in a relation of one-to-one correspondence. X is the code representation of A. This kind of connection can be called a code dependence. It is formed in either psychogenesis or ontogenesis of a self-organizing system and its functional element. A thorough investigation of the connection between A and X, of the structural and functional organization of the systems X-type, means of deciphering the brain code for this phenomenon subjective reality. This is a special cognitive task, including the hermeneutic approach aspect, the phenomenon of understanding information embodied in one or another barrier. Modern neuroscience has achieved significant success in deciphering the brain codes of subjective reality. The result being a visual image experienced by a human is reproduced on a computer screen. With the relation of these statements have been provided a theoretical and methodological analysis of the coding procedure, encoding and decoding processes, discretization and quantification methods of the subjective reality continuum, the formation of personal and interpersonal invariants of the selected phenomena of subjective reality as object of neuroscientific research, typology, typology of codes and relation of code structures of consciousness and unconscious processes, the connection and the difference between the detected neurodynamic correlate of a certain mental phenomenon and its actual code organization, the hypothesis on the reasons of appearance of the quality of subjective reality in the course evolution. Due to limited time of the report, I have to leave these questions aside to pay attention to the most important issue for our discussion, the issue of changing the negative properties of consciousness. The most important thing that I would like to emphasize is that if the phenomenon of subjective reality and its neurodynamic barrier have the same cause, are simultaneous and are in one-to-one correspondence, that means that when I myself control this phenomenon of subjective reality, I'm also controlling with my own will its neurodynamic barrier. Each of us has the ability to manage a certain class of his or her own brain neurodynamic systems, and at the same time manage the energy supply of these operations. And everyone does it all the time, often not very well, though. This determines the ability to arbitrarily control not only mental and bodily movements, but also certain vegetative processes. And moreover, the ability to achieve changes at the genetic level, as recent studies show. All these points to extremely large, still weakly used resources of psychic self-regulation and self-organization. From this perspective, there are opportunities for deeper research into the phenomena of tension of thought, tension of will, intensification of the creative processes and meditative practices for creation of a new effective ways of self-regulation, not only functional, but also moral. And this is directly related to the tasks of ethical self-improvement, which are set in the writing of Dalai Lama. Cultivating, as he stresses it, compassion and kindness of soul, the eradication of the spiritual, of rampant greed and aggression. The problem of neutralization and, in the long run, overcoming these negative properties of consciousness involves extensive use of the richest phenomenological and meditative experience of Buddhism. Of course, productive concepts of Western psychology are also important for this purpose. However, many hopes are associated with the development of neuroscience, which gradually clarifies certain brain functional structures responsible for the altruistic and selfish intentions, allows deeper understanding on the phenomenon of aggression. Studies in this direction are very diverse. I want to cite, as an example, research in the field of mirror systems, which I have already mentioned. They reveal the brain mechanisms of understanding in other people's emotions, of sympathy and compassion manifestations. As RIZZOLATTI and SINIGAGLIA writes, the ability of the brain to reflect the perception of the faces and gestures of the other people and instantly encode them in terms of visceromotor reactions provides a brain substrate for empathy and compassion that regulates and guides our behavior and relationships at various levels and in various ways. Certainly, research in this area and the creation of means for changing consciousness should be carried out under strict social and humanitarian control. Recently, neuroscience has enriched with much more effective methods of visualization and mapping of the brain process. Among them are methods of optochemistry and optogenetics, neuroradiology, or methods that allow penetrating into deep brain structures non-invasively through the skull bones using the effect of light passing through solids. This opens a new stage in development of neuroscience and gives grounds to optimistically assess the possibility of goal-seeking changes of these extremely persistent dispositional structures of consciousness that determine such negative qualities as irrepressible consumerism, aggressiveness, and extreme egoism. We can assume that this is the main problem of consciousness of our age. The future of human civilizations depends on its solution.
Your Holiness, would you like to ask something or comment? What is your opinion?
I very much appreciate such sort of scientists now really carrying, I think, a serious investigation and experiment. Wonderful. But still, I feel the complete or full explanation about mind or mental quality on the basis of brain, I don't think. Shivepana, the children of 가다지 쉐벌 정다되니 다 가나저 탐에베 남주지 르 로다다 벳 맨라지 쉐베드는 루트고 딜라바드 로 배치 가고 싶어.
For example,
Yes, go
His Holiness was making the point that, for example, based on training the mind through various techniques, including meditation, we know that,
And mainly analytical meditation.
through discursive analytic meditation, we know that individuals like the yogis can really, sort of develop a perspective and understanding that transcends what we normally, ordinarily kind of understand. So, and that level of transformation is taking place at the level of consciousness. But then to speak of the actual processes at the brain that would exactly mirror that, at this point, it's difficult to imagine.
Now, from the Buddhist viewpoint, of course, you see, at mental level, there is potential. This ignorant mind eventually become enlightened mind. But as far as the brain is concerned, I think there is limitation, I feel.
So there can be no enlightened brain. First, any other comments? Your Holiness.
I just want to share, I think Buddhist
Part of the Buddhist monastic training, it's a logic, training in logic and debate.
Bana 계지마다 시절이야 계지마다 계지마마인버스 니체. 다 계지면 나로리야 아니 숙시와 내면도 숨체. 다 숙슬럽도 차지 차요체. 시바슬럽도 그 숙제면버체. 그 용어랑 가는 거지. 자, 다 잘해야 아니 공연 시바. 다 아니 다 이기 넘버 시바슬럽 있는다 좋습니다. 다 그래. 소송 그래서 주르. 그봐. 남시 주. 다 되네 심중업 주저지. 군중아 영행아 아니 개와 주지 장년 주 년년 이슈 생규시 전행 업 주저지. 다 뒤에 시바를 칠레면다 여도 봐. 다 뒤에 군중아 슬도 시바 참말로 코리안로 되게. 영행아 슬도 유치라고 할 벽에 미기 되게. 시비시비 사고도 와. 디디 차상 레벨전인데 쉐이트다 패지 가고면 넣었음기. 죄송한데 레벨은 주어테니 10엔 넘줄면다 받아요야. 용용 그래. 용그래디 이네 대대 첩지 10에 지금 용하다 된대기 캐발을 때네 레벨로 추 구조 돼야지 된대 요래 맞잖아.
So he's receiving English translation, Russian translation, yeah? Yeah, okay.
Перевод есть? Перевод есть у вас? Перевод.
So His Holiness was saying that, he grew up in a particular education system, a scholastic system that introduces from a very early age as a young monk to a whole system of thinking, including debate. And the primary medium is really debate. So in the debating tradition, right from the beginning, a kind of a taxonomy of reality is created. So we say there are things that are conditioned, there are things that are not conditioned. Things that are conditioned are subject to causation, they are momentary, changes subject to change, and so on. And within that world of conditions, then you have material phenomena that are visible, occupy space, and so on, and that has obstructive properties, and dimensions, and so on. Then you have non-material phenomena like consciousness or mental processes, which are really understood primarily from their quality of subjective experience. Then you have a third category of phenomena, which are more like abstract attributes. So, for example, if we take the abstract idea of impermanence itself, impermanence is not material, impermanence is not consciousness, but it is an attribute, it's a phenomena. So those are a third category. Now within the second category, the category of mental phenomena, then we make distinctions between sensory processes and mental processes. And if you put all of them together, we have 5 senses and 1 mental faculty. And within the mental faculty, and distinctions are drawn between the primary awareness itself and then the various kind of modalities through which this awareness is expressed, referred to as mental factors. So within the mental factors, in the tradition, according to a particular text, 51 such mental factors are listed. These are
atomic.
So in Asanga's Pramana Samuchaya, for example, so whenever you have an experience, it is understood that that experience of mind will be always accompanied by at least 5 factors, such as sensation, volition, and so on. Then you have another 5 factors which are, become active when the mind is focused on a particular, activity. And then there are 11 virtuous mental factors, 20 derivative, secondary, afflictions, 6 primary, afflictions, and so on, all together. So there are all of these facets of mental experience are identified, defined, their properties explained, their functions explained, and the specificity of these explanations are such that His Holiness is not quite sure how would all of that map out and be explained purely at the level of brain.
But I think also because of the daily experience, sometimes you say your health, some problem, so certainly affect brain. That also sometimes you say affect our thinking. But same time, sometimes just your mind, some sort of past memory, happy memory or sad memory. Just because of that, you see, some effect of brain. So, seems to see there are 2 phenomena. One, brain, one, consciousness. So, grosser level of consciousness, very much related with brain. But at the same time, you see its own entity disorder.
The entity itself. Entity itself.
So very close connection, but basically different. So each one is the effect to other one, like that. So I just learn from these as a text, and also some extent, this is my own experience. I think last 60 years, certain concept, quite similar, that of quantum physics. I really meditate that, think, daily basis, analyze. That really affect my emotion, destructive emotion. Positive emotion increasing, negative emotion decrease. Because negative emotion, all based on grasping because of something, because of the
objective, something as if something exists objectively.
Like quantum physics, grasping,
So, for example, in quantum thinking, there is this idea that if you search for objective reality, it becomes untenable. So the moment you take that insight seriously, then your tendency to grasp onto something solid tends to be diminished.
Not just the intellectual level, some understanding, not that way. Thinking, decades, thinking, then you get some kind of real feeling, conviction, not only conviction, but some kind of feeling. That really affect emotion. So I don't think, you see, no matter how, because of great scientists, I don't think it's difficult to understand these things. Of course, with my respect, I feel like that.
Your Holiness, you are right in general. You are right. Моя теория объясняет связь явлений субъективной реальности, любых, мысль, образ, которым нельзя приписывать физические свойства. Так? Мысли нельзя, она не имеет массы, энергии и так далее. Как же она связана с позовым процессом? Это и есть самая трудная проблема. Она называется hard problem of consciousness. Вот эта проблема, значит, я ее объясняю на основе информационного подхода. А он требует анализа связи. То есть всякая информация воплощена в своем носителе. Это общий принцип. Так? Вот я вижу это, да? Мой образ. Это и есть моя информация, получаемая от этого предмета. Можно так сказать. Образ, информация необходимо связана с носителем своим, физическим носителем. Им является мозговой процесс определенный. Мозговая...
Перевод нужен, перевести мне нужно.
Мозговая нейродинамическая связь. Excuse me, please.
David is explaining that his theory is explaining the connection between the mental phenomena, the phenomena that cannot be possessing the physical qualities like thought, and the barriers of these mental events, mental properties, the brain processes. And he thinks that this connection is informational. His approach is called informational, and it explains the term of the information explains that relationship between the barrier, the brain, and the mind.
Я здесь не касаюсь тонких, сложных, разных явлений субъективной реальности, которые, скажем, во время медитации. Меня интересует принцип. Как можно их связать? Вот, скажем, информационный подход позволяет теоретически корректно установить эту связь. И тогда...
So I am not studying specific subtle states of mind or some states of mind that are related to meditation. I'm studying this connection in general. So the general states, the subjective states, and their relation to the brain.
不管的，伢子，他这个顿着开始起呢，开始公安是不是觉得，我说的，每个地址说都是切，哎呢，日本派去利用个要的，其实个，在每个党的要么的，因为派去七六个扎这个呢推个蛮着，对吧？ 자상가 되도 information 패시 한스게 되게 딱 그도 지금 영화스는 면도 지금 된적이야 자상가 되도 레벨로 다는데 컨디션 거야나 애가 좀아 계산이 공연 시바티니 가서다 뭐스다 내가 자체 애니 걸리야 내가 지금 미기 시바도 스타 turn to zane me nam ju to ne ji sha ju ro any information like do
so Holiness's question has perhaps more to do with clarification of what you mean by information. The question he has is this: for example, during the conception, when the fetus is in conception, after several weeks, the sensory modalities become active. The child does not actually see, but there are some sensory experiences, possibly hearing sounds. But at that level, the experience is very, very primitive. There is no content. And then when the child is born and sees the world, there's a lot more richness to the content. So when you say information, are you talking about the content of the experience, or what do you mean?
so according to my mother so some child still in mother's womb more active the because of the
The child kicks in the womb, yeah.
Конечно, кидается.
Oh, so some cases,
Ну,
so there must be something.
да.
Some sort of uncomfortable feeling or something.
So, there must be some reason why the child is kicking, whether it's discomfort or whatever.
Sensorial, not yet developed. At least not active, sensorial.
Да, является. The notion of information, there are two conceptions of information. Attributical conception, да, который, значит, весь мир, все имеет информацию.
So the whole universe, every physical. One approach is that everything in the universe has information.
And another conception, functional conception of информации. Да. Согласно этой концепции, информация есть только в самоорганизующихся системах, живых и социальных.
Okay, so according to this functional approach, the information exists only in the self-organized systems that are also alive, living in social mechanisms, systems.
Я употребляю понятие информации в общем смысле, как оно применяется во всех науках. Возьмите любую науку, там будет информация. Это смысл Виннера, Норберта Виннера. Информация есть содержание сообщений, содержание сигнала. И все. И этого мне достаточно.
I am using the concept defined, I'm using the term as it was defined by Winner, which, according to his definition, the information is something that has a message or content. Content.
И последнее. And last.
Then another phenomena.
And last.
We ourselves, you see, not fully understand according to Buddhist sort of the psychology. Psychology is mare. That corresponds. The other ones do. 그게 다 뉴질랜드 아마 투된 사고자 가 그저 투된 여봐 나 그게 뉴질랜드야 40회 리드 전에 아마 투된 좋은니 님은 신사샤 제니 투좀 쉬었다 베스르지 대샤 나도 돈도 야말다 제니 이니 디 투좀을 대니 님의 시버디 관다 미 라고 예면되기 라고 예배 두스 신라 두스 주야 차죠. 딱 안주 드셔 집도야 말이. 거다 세샤인도 전에 낭지 토숨 다 러시제 육군도 가차르지. 근데 낭지 토숨 룽중 낭지 토숨 중차르지. 다 왜세 내가 봐. 서다가 류 구조자들이 캡식을 놓고 치고 봐. 캡슐롱 데 러시아 제주군도 봐 팀에 커둘다 나와 당고 나와니 버서 커둘이야 아니 간다디 캡슐롱 뒤차르 다류 요야디 캡슐롱리 캡슐롱 뒤차르 아니 셰바 왜서 참못되기 엔념돌이요 되게 송진신도 차에 류 요야리야 그래서 저 치게나 나이 신고 맞다디 치je 두고 말이 종리 종물이 드디어는 애들 나이데 그 투대 말 가서 라바도 갔어. 거기서 줘서 가서 라로 사말래. 아무 별에 사지 싶으리. 저 콩고 지송기 콩 지으시 말이 저상가 이런 게 지를 넣으셔 아카 더 찬스 빠르게 수샤वर 봤어 아니 이 공시와 또 두동을 시주전에 왜서 샤죠리 가다 디 호스피탈도 가 맹강리아 맹강 MG 총차샤스 다이네 대단히 면다시시대샤 아니 찬스 되버리 맹강나 샤는 그랬어 도사 아주 도스타요 아다 지지 빠르게 수샤는 이는 그저 근처 잡도가 싱거르다 어때 먼저 한테 셈 차하게 신 리든 저 거로 자야요데 이네디 아니 잡식을 두서리 젤이야 라고 예매 구조 때문에 라고 예매 신라네 도수 주셔야돼 근처 좀 신분도 아니 가서서 호수는 동지야 깨서
This discussion about the connection between the brain processes and the mental processes, and also the Buddhist understanding of the various levels of subtlety in consciousness, the grosser levels being more dependent upon the brain processes. His Holiness was saying that it reminds him of one event that took place in New Zealand, and it's a phenomenon that even the Buddhists don't really have an explanation. This was the death of a Lama by the name of Gusho Thupten. And when His Holiness was visiting New Zealand...
Generally, I think quite good practitioner, very humble.
So His Holiness was visiting, and it so happened... So this monk was actually quite a humble Lama, not pretentious, and then His Holiness was saying that, sometimes you have gishis, the great scholars who are full of words, but not much in substance in terms of the experience. So, this monk had died in a hospital, and the doctor has declared the patient to be dead. But on the other hand, the doctor was quite surprised the way in which the monk was sitting in a particular posture. And the doctor was empathetic enough and told the attendants that, he's dead, but he's sitting in a very unusual position. And I'll leave it up to you, you can keep the body as how you want to deal with it. We don't have to worry about the bed. So he was the attendants were able to keep the body as it is, and he remained in that state for 4 days. Now, according to Buddhist explanation, he's in a state of clear luminosity. So the various physiological processes has come to an end, the breath, of course, respiration, all of that. And according to Buddhist text, there is a very detailed description of these dissolution processes. So there are, for example, 8 main stages of the dissolution process, culminating in what is known as the experience of mere luminosity or clear light of death. Now, at that point, the understanding in the Buddhist tradition is that the connection, the link between the actual body and the mind has come to an end. There's only the subtle consciousness. But the strange thing is, on the third day, on the fourth day, there was a change in the posture. His left hand was holding his ring finger of the right hand.
Like this.
So there is no explanation even in Buddhist text, because this is a stage where the body and mind's connection is supposed to have ceased. So His Holiness, when he heard this, he was so surprised. He said the first thing he thought was, and he actually told the monk, you should have put a camera there. At least we will know, what happened. Otherwise, the only explanation you have is a ghost went in and put the other finger in the other hand. So there are phenomena where, we just don't have the explanation.
So scientifically, brain already dead. The concerned doctor.
I don't understand too. but but when you see this vase, you have some information about this object. In this time, in your brain, there is some neurodynamical system, which what is connection between your image of this glass and your neurodynamical system. I call it neurodynamical equivalent.
kumshi.
When a tameba the glass
yes,
the
yes, yes,
sheba
yes,
skebe in
Да.
ten negalia the kind of labor rang nam ju
Then I analyze this connection.
Yes.
This is the main question. The connection between image, subjective reality, and my neurodynamical system. This is one causal phenomena, одновременный,
Simultaneous.
simultaneous, and one-to-one отношение.
Relation.
Correspondence.
Correspondence.
One-to-one.
Correspondence.
Then information has three features. Syntactic, semantic, senses.
Semantic, yes.
Semantic, sense,
Meaning.
And third, this is pragmatic. Rule. Information can rule. When your child do it. His emotion, when he angry and he some something like the information is a factor ruling our body and the other people.
Потому что следующий доклад не успели уже сделать. Следующий доклад не успеют вообще сделать.
Поэтому, да. Нет, управляют. Мы управляем собой управляем.
Dear colleagues, I am very sorry to interrupt. I think it is a very deep and serious discussion because it touches the essence of the context between the Buddhist science and modern science and philosophy. But I have first to correct myself. The program has been actually changed because we want all Russian speakers to give their talks in the presence of His Holiness until he leaves. So there are 3 talks in the morning and 1 talk after that. Then we will have a lot of time until the dinner for our common discussion.
Yes.
So I'm very sorry, we are 20 minutes late by our schedule. We will have 2 more talks and questions and comments from His Holiness, and then the common discussion between us will be after 2:30. So if you allow me, I will introduce our next speaker. Dr. Maria Falikman. She is a senior research fellow at the Moscow State University and also at several other institutions. She is a psychologist, especially interested in the issues of cognitive neuroscience. She has been working in the fields of human attention, and developing some of the Russian traditions of cultural historical approach and activity theory, which were developed in Russian psychology with the modern neuroscience also techniques. And she is also a founder and academic director of the Moscow Seminar for Cognitive Science for many years.
Your Holiness, dear participants and colleagues, my talk will be much more local and specific, and I'll try to introduce a couple of Russian scientific psychological approaches towards consciousness, not speaking directly about consciousness, but speaking directly about a topic which is intimately related to it, which is human attention. And as probably all scholars in the psychology of attention, I'll start with a famous citation from the American psychologist William James. A citation which probably killed all psychology of attention in advance, which says, everyone knows what attention is. In fact, James further explains what he means. His writing, as you can see, this is taking possession of the mind in a clear and vivid form of one of out what seem to be several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. Focalization, concentration of consciousness, of its essence. It supplies withdrawal from some things in order to deal effectively with others. And it's a condition which has a real opposite in the confused, dazed, scatterbrained state. And from this citation, it's clear that attention is obvious introspectively through perceptual clearness and the feeling of mental effort. It is clear in external observation. You see when someone is attentive, like the posture, eyes, ears, whatever. And it's obvious through its effects, like image fixation or stabilization, like processing enhancement or increased sensitivity to different properties of the object, like its shape or details or whatever, and also the minimization of errors in our performance. However, at the same time, attention escapes or vanishes from the scientific research all the time. As one of Russian psychologists, Pyotr Galperin, shows there are two problems with studying attention as a separate mental function. It's never given in cognitive research as a separate process. It's always coupled with something like with perception. You are attentive to an object, you see an object, you're attentive to it, or with remembering, or with thinking, or with action. You are attentive, you just act attentively, or you follow a certain train of thoughts. Right. And in the scientific research, it has got no specific product. It's just a more detailed perceptual image, or better memory trace, or a more elaborate solution, less mistakes in the performance. So there is no attention, and for a century, in fact, no one knows what attention is. And as the author of one of handbooks on the psychology of attention, Harold Peschler, writes, and I like this statement, there may even not be an it to be known about. Although, of course, there might be. So there is a contradiction in the studies of attention. It's given to us introspectively, and we can manipulate it, and still we cannot catch it. It fades out in the research. And this contradiction was probably the best described by the same William James, who proposed to distinguish two types of attentional theories. They're called cause theories and effect theories. In cause theories, attention is understood as a separate force which influences or modulates information processing, or so to say, causes changes in our perception and cognition and personal feelings, maybe by assigning processing priorities or distributing some mental resource. It was the basic idea of the founder of scientific psychology, Wilhelm Wundt, who understood attention as a perception or volitional act, an act of free will that moves the person from separate elements to the whole image, meaningful image. And it was basically the idea of Daniel Kahneman 100 years after that, who proposed the resource allocation model of attention. On the other hand, there is a bunch of effect theories in which attention is understood as a byproduct of the functional system, of the information processing system, just an effect of this system performance or its emergent property, like in Wundt's disciple Edward Titchener's model, who understood attention just as a property of consciousness, a specific level of so-called sensory clearness. Or like in the modern neural network approach, in which attention is a product of competition within the network, directing it to choosing just one object. And it's interesting that both approaches re-emerged in Russian psychology in the attempt to understand human attention through the framework of theories proposed in Russia during the 20th century. And I was asked to introduce these approaches, and then I'll proceed to showing how they work on the specific empirical material. Probably the most interesting for me is the approach proposed in the beginning of the 20th century by Lev Vygotsky, who is currently becoming increasingly popular in the West. It's like a Vygotskian wave in the Western psychology, and his approach is called cultural historical approach. It's not just to attention, it's just to the understanding of human mind and human consciousness. And it was an attempt to propose a unified view of mind, brain, and culture, an understanding of how mind is formed within a culture, and how brain subserves its processes. And in introducing his approach, Vygotsky opposes so-called higher mental functions and natural mental functions. We are all born with natural mental functions, such as natural memory and ability to remember something and to retrieve something, natural attention to loud voices, sounds, bright signals, something dangerous. But in fact, the functions, mental functions used by an adult person are higher mental functions developed within the culture. When the child is born in the culture, he is being taught to use his mental functions exactly as he's being taught to use, for example, a spoon or a fork to eat. And thus, our higher mental functions are social, are first shared between a child and a caregiver, for example, a mother, and they then become interiorized, and thus we can voluntarily control them, and they are mediated in their nature. This is an important point for me. I'll stop here for a while. In natural functions, we just, for example, remember here now and recall there. I'm now asked to come at 4 o'clock here, and I remembered in this point, and it's now 4 o'clock, and there is no that moment when I was asked to come, but I remember and I come, or maybe I don't remember, and that's the problem, what to do. For example, I make a mark here on my hand, or I fix a reminder, or I use a mental image or a person who asked me to come, and my mental functions become mediated. Here, natural function comes from A to B, and the mediated function use the medium, the mental tool, which is present both at the situation A and at the situation B. And as Vygotsky himself poses, a man introduces artificial stimuli, signifies behavior, and by means of the science creates new connections in the brain. Please pay attention to this. From outside. Admitting this, we presume a new regulatory principle of behavior, a new understanding of determination of human reactions, namely a principle of significations. A man creates externally new connections in the brain, controls the brain, and thus controls the body. And the idea of how we control our brain was further developed by one of Vygotsky's disciples, Alexander Luria, also pretty well known in the West, who developed the idea of systemic organization and dynamic localization of higher mental functions. As higher mental functions are mediated, they work all together, they work in the system, and this system is implemented in the brain dynamically. We cannot say memory is here, attention is there, perception is here, and thinking is there. It's the complex system that involves different areas of the brain. And Luria, who was developing the theory of brain damages, especially in the speech pathology, as Professor Chernigovskaya knows better than me, felt really important to show how compensation after the brain damage is possible. And it is possible because high mental functions are organized dynamically and systemically. And if we apply this to attention, we can see that.
Okay.
Can I proceed?
Yeah.
Attention is a higher mental function, demonstrates all the characteristics of higher mental functions. It's social and it is mediated. For example, if we take the issue of selective attention, what to attend, and if we see a mother and a child, what goes on? Mom directs child's attention. Oh, look, that's a dog. Oh, look, that's disgusting. Oh, that's beautiful. And the child learns to select potential objects of attention. And that's the same with sustained attention, how to remain attentive. It's possible that mom just holds kid's arm, or maybe teaches to follow with the finger along the lines in the book. And afterwards, all these external tools become internal. So the child learns to use his or her own attention, maybe exactly as meditative practices or debate practices taught at the monasteries. I don't know, that's the question.
맞아, 나랑 망해 별로 쓰잖아요. 지금 나야지 중보로 봐. 데리고 일을 저 열에 요말해. 가. 저서 그들이 자상가 나야 차네 일을 저 지겨지. 야 망해 비체. 대로다. 다들 가세요.
Would you translate?
아주 루지 되는
In Buddhist epistemology, in the Tibetan tradition, there's a kind of basic taxonomy of 7 categories.
The Tibetan is malo.
그래. 우리 뒤에 들어봐. 배배로.
그래.
이 딸이 이주도 들으듯이 사변 고난 죽을링 말아.
이주 캠링에다 지켜. 디 남진은 야마래.
나 배제 가보면로 그 무엇이다. 다음에 무엇?
어디게? 어이게. 저는 아주 배배산 디산디 잡다.
So in Buddhist epistemology, we speak of a sevenfold typology of mental phenomena. It's more from a cognitive perspective. One of which is referred to as inattentive perception. So a child may have all sorts of information that is, impinging upon her brain or her mind, but is able to have the ability to recall only a fraction of it. So it seems that there is an attention, but this is a kind of, at a very, very primal level, there is an attention. Because otherwise, if there is no attention, the mind simply wouldn't perceive anything. So there is some kind of directing and the ability to just take that as a content.
Right.
But then that doesn't lead to the ability to recall. It seems to need something else.
Yeah.
So what would you say to that kind of very primary level of experience, of perception?
It's probably that growing up, we just acquire new tools and new abilities to control our primary inattentive sensory flow, to select and to deeper process some objects. Maybe. Well, at the end of my talk, I'll ask you more questions, which would be probably for further discussions, and I'm really eager to have your opinion, in fact.
장배. 나는 망에 들을래 배지 알아. 반나라 망해 봐. 고수직나 엔데데 망해 봤다. 들을래 배지 알아.
So this basic inattentive perceptions we can even attribute in animals.
Right, yeah. But animals, in Vygotsky's terminology, animals can possess only natural mental functions, only those they are born with. And
couldn't one speak about culture within the animal social world?
We can speak about social traditions, behavioral traditions, but we cannot speak about teaching to use tools and about internalization of the tools.
We can.
Can we?
We can.
Okay.
And it is proved long ago. There are many
internal tools, not external tools. I do know about external tools, but I do not know about internal. We'll probably talk later, okay?
You should read papers.
Right. We're all too narrow-minded in science, right? Okay. And just to proceed, one more, Vygotsky's disciple, Alexei Leontiev, further proceeded to the so-called activity theory. Some theorists consider it a very separate theory. Others speak about the common cultural historical activity approach, because Leontiev does elaborate on some Vygotsky's ideas, and he does propose some new ideas that can help in the organization of the research. And according to Leontiev's approach, which is now actually widely used in psychology, from education to organizational psychology and even to subjective well-being, the problem developed by his grandson Dmitry Leontiev, currently in Russia. And according to the basic Alexei Leontiev's approach, behavioral activity and mental activity share the same structure. That's the very important point. It's a systemic structure. They are socially rooted. They are both mental activity and behavioral activity. They are mediated. And then Leontiev proceeds to the analysis of the structure of activity. He understands the situation So that motivity is driven by a so-called motive, or the subject of our need, our objective need, and it consists of goal-directed actions, which are realized through operations determined by the conditions of the activity. I want to drink, I have to take a cup, but operations will be different if it's a glass and a cup with a handle, and operations are underlaid by psychophysiological functions. And it's important that in Leontief's understanding, it's the level of goals which is consciously represented to the subjects. We might be unaware of the motives. We are basically unaware of the operations. I can take this or that, not being aware of the position of my fingers. And in the search for the neural basis of activity, for the understanding how it is organized, Leontief addressed to early bio-cybernetic models, yesterday mentioned by Professor Alexandrov, feedback models by Piotr Anokin, and first of all by Nikolai Bernstein. So this is the scheme of how activity is organized according to Leontief's idea. So it's motive-driven. Motive produces specific goals which direct actions, and the goal under specific... the goal under specific conditions is defined as a task solved or performed by the subject. And actions are realized through operations relevant to conditions. And operations are served by certain psychophysiological functions or neural substrate. And to understand this neural substrate, Leontief uses the physiology of activity, a very original approach proposed by Nikolai Bernstein first in the 1930s, then developed in the 1950s and 60s, and now also appreciated by the Western physiology, and in fact reborn in the concept of predictive coding, which is actively discussed during the last 2 or 3 years. And for example, we can discuss the recent monography by the philosopher Andy Clark, Surfing the Uncertainty.
We're just talking about behavior here.
Yeah. And Bernstein tries to understand movements, but Leontief will use his scheme, and I'll show how it will happen, to understand cognition, perception, and consciousness. According to Bernstein's approach, any movement is not a reaction, but an action. So every movement is a performance of a certain motor task, and it is a construction of movement according to the goal, which is being carried out through iterative comparisons of the task, what we need to do, and the current state of our body and of the environments through the feedback loops. So Bernstein's moves from the so-called Cartesian arc or reflective arc to refractory ring depicted here. We compare and correct our movement, compare and correct, and thus we are all the time active. So it's probably the way out of the so-called Cartesian trap. Disjunction between the active soul and the reactive body machine. In Bernstein's understanding, body is as active as the mind. And it's interesting that it is a hierarchy of neural levels providing for these comparisons or corrections. And the leading level corresponds to the meaning of the task and is accessible to consciousness. This is an important point. For example, I want to drink, and I'm drinking. This is the leading level. It's an action with a certain object. I pour the water, and I take the cup. And basically, there are lots of other operations and corrections. I have to hold my fingers and have to direct my movement. This is this goes on out of consciousness. These background levels just subserve performance. But if we remember the idea of the similar structure of behavioral activity and mental activity, is it that we can try to understand perceptual tasks in the same manner as motor tasks? Can we try to explain our perception and further attention through the structural and functional analysis of activity? Because if we consider any perceptual task, it has got a goal to notice something, to detect something, to recognize something. We've got conditions that prevent from doing so. For example, the presentation is too brief or masked or rapid, or there are lots of distractors. And we've got some available cognitive operations, somehow similar to motor operations, like encoding or comparison or retention or whatever. And all the operations have got their neural substrates. What's interesting, the concept of perceptual task, the construction of perceptual image, applies to most attention tasks used in cognitive psychology for 50 or 60 or 70 years, like this visual search task. For example, we've got a cluttered environment. We have to find a cup or a seesaw or whatever. It requires perception, but it does require attention. And it's interesting that from the activity theory we can derive two hypotheses about the nature of attention, which directly refer to James's distinction of cause theories and effect theories. Because when we take a look at the functional system of our activity, there is activity, there is conscious representation of the goal and the goal level of its organization, and there are neural mechanisms. And we can consider attention as the left picture just as a byproduct or epiphenomenon of this very system. Its manifestation through consciousness. We are conscious of the object of our activity, of our goal. And its manifestation through performance. We make less mistakes because of the organization of our activity. Or we can consider attention as a separate mental activity, which launches, maintains, constructs, suppresses, and transforms this very functional system. And both hypotheses have got their own understanding of the properties of attention. Because if we consider attention as the epiphenomenon of the organization of our activity, then all properties of attention, such as selectivity or concentration or limited number of objects or switching costs or whatever, are just properties of activity and should be understood in the terms of its structure. But if we consider attention a separate mental activity, then its properties should be described and measured as they universally manifest themselves through various cognitive tasks, various types of activity. Maybe it's somehow related to the idea of attention as a mental factor in Buddhism. That's the point I'll fix here for the further discussion. And now I'm going to test these two hypotheses against the phenomenon mentioned 2 days ago by Barry Kerzin, the so-called attentional blink phenomenon. You've definitely heard about, because it's the phenomenon discussed in the Western psychology. It's one of the attentional mistakes which emerges under the condition of rapid serial visual presentation, just to give you a feeling how it looks like. If we got a sort of rapid visual presentation and two tasks within the sequence, for example, to identify a white letter and to discover whether it was the letter X after it somewhere. There happens a sort of the blink of our mind's eye. We don't close eyes, we don't blink, but there is a transient deficit in the awareness for the second of two target items, or maybe a number of such items, after we identify the first one. Within the very brief period, like from 200 to 500 milliseconds. And why is this phenomenon important? Besides that, it's a model of our everyday mental overload, which also causes sufferings in lots of people. It seems to reflect a bottleneck in the information processing or temporal costs in allocating our selective attention. And it's interesting that it allows to investigate both consciousness, the awareness of the targets, and unconscious processing. When we don't notice something during the blink, we can study to what level it is processed. And in fact, there was just a boost of research, like 700 publications in 25 years. And all types of cause and effect theories of attention were applied to explain the effect. And I'll show the very specific examples. In my studies, where I tried to understand this phenomenon through the idea of the organization and mediation of our perceptual activity, I proposed the hypothesis that if we reorganize our perceptual activity, there will probably be no blink. If we enlarge the processing unit and change the level of the organization of activity, then they'll probably avoid this error. What I did, I showed words letter by letter, and I set a separate, absolutely separate task about the first letter of the word, and I created the condition where some other words could be lost or skipped, and there still will be a meaningful letter. So I made a sort of unitization in the rapid processing, and on the red graph you see that as compared to the standard condition, the attentional blink is substantively reduced. And it's absolutely the effect of the reorganization of activity. But at the same time, and literally at the same time, Richard Davidson's group took unexperienced observers and provided them with 3 months of the intensive meditation practice. They practiced Vipassana or bare attention, like 12 hours a day. And then they tested them again with the attentional blink paradigm. And they got the same results. They got no attentional blink. And they also managed to demonstrate what I didn't, because we just didn't record this data. They demonstrated the change of the electrical response of the brain, of the EEG, to the first of 2 targets, which could be interpreted as if the detection became less resource-consuming in those guys who practiced Vipassana. And here, it seems that this specific experience is the cause of the attentional blink reduction. Both cause and effect alternatives might be true. And for me, I believe that more data from meditation studies would be really advantageous in understanding the functional system of human attention. And my key questions could be formulated as follows. Yeah.
For clarification, am I right in thinking that your particular intervention modified the experiment so that the spacing, the timing, so what exactly did you do?
The basic conditions were all the same. What I did was that I presented not random letters.
You had a meaningful...
Yes, it was a word presented letter by letter at the same speed with 2 separate tasks for letters within this word.
And because of the semantic content, is that...
No,
okay.
no, the blink disappeared. So just through reorganization and unitization. And so my key questions are, first, given that meditation is obviously a cultural practice, a learned practice, which reshapes our cognition. There are lots of data now, for example, for the binocular rivalry or Stroop attentional test or whatever, and practice which changes our brain, for which there are also really interesting data, even concerning the volume of cortices. Could we say that bare attention practiced in Vipassana is in fact a mediated form of attention? And if it is so, what's the nature of the cultural tool which is involved in this practice? And what's interesting for me is there a room for unitization? I was studying in it. Is it that practicing meditation, a person moves from elementary perception, from single objects, to the holistic image of the world? And if so, what are, again, the mechanisms and the neural substrate of this unitization? And I thank you for your attention. I will appreciate your comments. And I hope we'll return to this topic in the discussion.
I have one question.
No.
The animal, or including human being, is there some differences? The social animal, which by nature is an individual's sort of happiness or existence, is depend on rest of the community. Then those, some like tiger or like that, just individually. So any differences on the brain?
Well, in fact, I really like Vygotsky's definition, who wrote that while any animal just uses its mental functions, humans control their mental functions and master to control their mental functions. And an animal can, in principle, be taught to conceptualize, to control their mental function, but they don't need it. They don't need it for survival. Whereas a human being in the society needs the control of their memory, attention, and thought.
No, actually, His Holiness's question was a bit more fundamental.
Yeah.
Given the reality of some animals being more social than others,
Yeah.
so between the less social animals and the social animals, can one speak of qualitatively different brain structures?
Oh, well, that's the question to physiologists, basically. I don't know, because as attention can be studied only through its effect.
This connection, since many years, let's say, I'm wondering the feeling of appreciation. Dogs, birds, if you feed,
Right.
they show some indication of appreciation. Then mosquito.
No.
When my mood good, and then there's a guarantee no malaria, then occasionally I give blood to mosquito. So the mosquito enjoy my blood, and then fill. Then their stomach become red. No indication of appreciation.
No.
Just a fly. So, which level of brain have the capacity show appreciation? And here also maybe some connection, social animal.
Maybe that's...
Some scientists now, some occasion they mentioned, you see, 2 mice, or 3 mice, 1 mice, you see, 2 mice get some sort of injuries. I think scientists, deliberately they create that, I think. Then 1 mice with injuries remain lonely, alone. Another mice who have some injuries with another mice. So that mice, injured mice, you see, constantly receiving licking from other mice.
Right.
So the speed of recover, the mice remain lonely longer time. The
Right.
mice who receive some licking much faster recover.
Now that's
So what you can explain according brain?
well the
Same mice,
yeah.
not much culture, no linguist.
No.
Oh.
Well, there is still a social structure, yeah? And I'm not sure there are now clear explanations in science of the difference between social structure in the animals and social structure in the humans. Huh?
You simply do not know.
Well, I simply do know some of them. Yeah, but it will be really a long discussion, yeah? And of course, social structure is beneficial for survival. If we take a perspective of this co-evolution of sociality and biological substrate, yeah? When genes prioritize a certain social structure and cultural tools, and culture in turn gives priority to some genotypes and so forth. It's an intertwined system, yeah, and it is clear that the support from the social structure is beneficial for the survival. But I'm afraid that the topic of my talk is just a bit far from this discussion of the ability for compassion or gratitude or appreciation in other species rather than human beings. But I do believe it's really an important topic of discussion. So thank you for your comment.
Your Holiness, would you like to have some reflections on the questions which Maria raised and some of the in relation to Buddhist practice?
Nothing special. Chance get to
I think we will have time later. Yeah.
Good.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We now move to our final talk during this morning session. It will be given by Dr. Dmitry Volkov. He is co-director and one of the founders of the Center for the Consciousness Studies at the Moscow State University. And his topic as a philosopher has been a philosophy of consciousness. Somebody will help you. He made his PhD in the analysis of the particular Western philosopher Daniel Dennett on the consciousness, and he wrote a book about this. And later on, recently, he completed his habilitation degree, which is on the issues of free will and moral responsibility. And Dmitry has been also very active in organizing the contacts between the Russian philosophers and Western analytical philosophers. He organized visits of a number of outstanding Western philosophers of consciousness to Russia and a number of international meetings in this respect. So, Dmitry, please.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. I would like to talk about some of the issues that everybody is concerned, probably. It's the issue of self. So, one of the main issues discussed in the contemporary analytic philosophy today, and in Russian analytic philosophy in particular, is the problem of personal identity. So this problem of personal identity consists in two main big questions. One question is what is self? And the other question is, how do we know and how can we identify a person at one particular time with a person in some other time? So the interest to this issue was recently propelled by some new discussions in neuroscience and also in some developments on artificial intelligence, which widen our understanding of the mind and the brain. So both philosophers and scientists are working on these issues. But the interest is also supported or justified by some very important concerns of every day. For instance, how do we find somebody responsible for an action? So imagine I did some action in the past, and maybe it was a wrong, immoral action. So a few months later, you find out that I did something wrong, and you blame me for this. You say, Dmitry is responsible for doing something in the past. That means that you have identified me today with me in the past. I can also blame myself and say, I think I did something wrong. I did an immoral action. So I blame myself. So I also can identify myself now with somebody in the past. So how do I do this? It's a big question. And also maybe for Buddhists, there's another very big question is, okay, so I am a reincarnation of some other Lama or some other person. Now, how do I identify with this person? What are the reasons that are justifying the identification of one person with another? So maybe Buddhists have this special concern. But maybe the answer to this question is very simple. Maybe we know it as a fact. Maybe it is obvious. But I think contemporary philosophers and scientists think that this is not very obvious. And there are two reasons for this. Well, first reason is persons are not unified agents. So person and personal brain, the brain of a human resembles a society made out of separate modules that have their cognitive functions. It's composed of multiple modules which execute a discrete cognitive function, relatively autonomous from one another. Well, to cite one of the leading neuroscientists, he's saying human brain has a variety of widely distributed nonverbal systems that are nonetheless able to produce and control behavior. These behaviors are observed by a speaking part of the brain in the left hemisphere as an interpreted. So if one module if one module produces a strange behavior, the other modules are rationalizing to explain it. So we see this in neural syndromes such as anosognosia, which is a class of mental illnesses which is accompanied by the denial of illness, and in the split brain patients. But we also see this in the normal brain. The brain can be viewed as a set of multiple agents who are retrospectively rationalizing about each other's behavior. In other words, parts of the brain are telling the stories about the motives of the other parts. The lack of unification and superficial integration, or at least not a complete integration in the brain, poses the first obstacle to personal identification. But there's another one. So persons constantly change. Almost nothing stays constant during the lifespan of a person. For instance, the white blood cells change every an average more than a year. Red blood cells change every more or less 4 or 5 months. The skin cells, they change every 3 or 4 weeks. So the body constantly changes. Out of about 50 to 70 trillion cells that compose our body, everything is changing. So nothing stays constant. What is the basis of identification? And psychological states also change all the time. We experience this and then we experience that, and the experiences go one after another. We change our priorities. We change our values sometimes. We change our personality. We acquire and lose memories. So in these respects, this little child, this adult, and teenager and adult, and an old person, they're very different. What grounds the belief that these are the same people, the same person? Maybe we just feel it inside, that it's the same person? I think that's not the case. Inner states constantly change, leaving nothing but a degrading set of memories. So I'm now here at the conference, I'm experiencing myself here. I can see parts of my body, but I don't have anything in the content that is the content of experiencing myself. And we were talking the other day about this, and some said, we experience self. I don't experience self. I don't know who experiences self and what it is to experience self. It seems that the self is a very, very elusive entity. And it is hard to see it, or it's very difficult to track it from the third-person perspective, but also from the first-person perspective. So Western philosophers developed 3 different approaches to this. They wanted to solve this problem, to identify what is self in different moments. So they came up with 3 solutions. And I think all of them are wrong. So one solution is mental substance approach. What is it, mental substance approach? According to mental substance approach, according to some mental substance approach, what makes one person the same as another at different times is the same soul, or something like a mental substance that stays numerically identical. The soul has multiple different qualities, properties, like mental states and psychological characteristics, but they're not essential for identity because they change all the time. Most lay people in the West think that that is the right theory. However, this approach is vulnerable to philosophical criticism. It is vulnerable to a principle called the verification principle. And I could go into the details why the verification principle is right, but it's right in a certain way. According to this principle, the statement that has no means of verification is a meaningless statement. I think it is possible to show that the statement that I am the same person as I am 10 years ago, because I have the same soul, this is meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. And the reason why it doesn't is because I would like to give you a thought experiment. So scientists come up with experiments. And scientists come up with experiments. Modern-day philosophers come up with thought experiments. So this is the thought experiment. Imagine we are sitting now in this room, and me and Konstantin, we have souls. But suddenly, briefly, our souls change places. So my soul is now in Konstantin's body, and his soul is in my body now. But Konstantin has all his memories still there with his body and with his brain. And all my memories and all my experiences stay with me. We just switched bodies. But Konstantin does not know that that happened. Neither do I. We can all have the souls switching places now, and we would not notice. Because nobody notices this except by the content. So,
가서 풍물이 되시면 다시 시도. 원래 soul
So our souls could change places and nobody would notice. So I think that's absurdity, which leads to the conclusion that this approach is wrong.
Yeah, but that's just a thought experiment.
Of course, but thought experiments can give you very good results. And in science, a lot of the times they also use thought experiments. Albert Einstein was using very, important. Newton was using thought experiments. They proved some very important facts.
But your point is that even if, for the sake of argument, two souls were to switch,
Yeah.
the individuals won't feel a difference.
Because
that's the point you're making.
That's the point, because if we take only the soul and leave the memories and personal traits separate, soul is nothing. Now, the bodily approach. So the bodily approach is the second approach, so we need to move to another approach. So according to the bodily approach, what stays the same is the body, is the brain. And maybe it's not the same, but maybe it's continuous. One, the cells change and they change over time, but it's, so a person at time t is the same as a person at time t, next time. If they're physically continuous, or their brain is physically continuous. Okay, so this is the way we track each other. We don't know anything about our souls, but we track each other by the body. We say, oh, that's the same body. Maybe this is that person, or maybe that's that person. Maybe. Okay, but there's a problem with this. And another thought experiment that shows why it is a problem.
Please do not transplant my brain.
Yes. So over the last 20 or 30 years, you may ask to transplant your brain. I mean, in the 20 or 30 brain. And the reason why is because there's a huge progress in in organ transplantation. We developed very important techniques for transplanting livers, lungs, even hearts have been transplanted. And why? Because we have developed very good solutions of ex vivo storage, the storage outside of the body, of the organs. We also developed really good approaches to maintain the immune system response. And we also developed techniques for vascular anastomose, which is the connection of the blood vessels. So it is not impossible to translate a brain at some time. But also we know that the brain is composed of two hemispheres, so it is possible to actually transplant one brain hemisphere. And I would like you to imagine a situation like this. So I have my brain in my skull, and there are two donors, two people. I'm transplanting my left hemisphere into one person, and I'm transplanting my right hemisphere into the other person. Let's call this lefty, and let's call this righty. So now lefty has my left hemisphere, and righty has my right hemisphere. Very nice. I think it would be possible in future, if we connect enough nodes in the brain, and I know they may be skeptical that we will do it tomorrow, maybe we'll do it in 100 years. It doesn't matter for the thought experiment. But these bodies will survive. This is very good. Where am I? I don't know where am I. Am I lefty or am I righty now? In which body am I? So it is a problem because the bodily criterion cannot really explain where I am. So this shows at least that the bodily criterion is insufficient. It doesn't tell us where we are in certain situations. But there's another reason why we need to think that it is wrong. It is the transplantation of a person onto an artificial platform. A lot of Russian scientists and a lot of Russian philosophers as well, and cognitive science, think that it is potentially possible to transplant the person onto an artificial platform, recorded as a software. And some people even think that it will not only possible to simulate the outgoing signals of a human brain, but it will be also possible to actually instantiate, realize a person in that artificial platform. Now
그래서
today, so I call it uploading mind to a computer. This is like this. My mind is now in the computer. I don't have a body, but I'm still myself. I can still be myself. I can still be a person. So this hypothetical scenario, this thought experiment, shows that maybe my body is not important for personal identity. Maybe it's not has nothing to do with my personality, my being the same person. So we are left with another approach called psychological approach, and most Russian philosophers, according to the survey, and probably philosophers in the West as well, subscribe to the psychological approach. So what it says that the person at time t is the same person as time t1 if a person at that previous moment is psychologically continuous with that person now. By psychological continuity, I mean psychological connectedness, say same body traits, same personality, and also causal connection. I'm sure Buddhists would support this, the causal connection between these psychological traits and values. So this approach avoids at least some type of criticism, at least maybe the bodily the uploading of the body to the computer. This is partially the reason why the majority of Russian philosophers consider psychological criterion as the most promising. However, there's a problem with this approach too. It is vulnerable to the hypothetical case, another thought experiment, of reduplication. What is it? So if you can theoretically copy my psychological traits from one place to another, then as you all know, we can make many copies. We can make many copies of presentation or files. If myself is like a file or a computer software, then we can have many selves. So look at this guy. He's got many other successes. He's one, but now he's all his clones. Okay, there are many people with same psychology now and causally connected with him in some way, and they're all me? This would be strange, right? So I think that the reduplication scenario shows that psychological approach leads to absurdity. So now what am I suggesting? Is there anything to suggest? And I suggest a quite loose concept of personal identity. It's very soft connection. And it's kind of subjective. So my view is, I think it's probably close to something of a Buddhist thought, but for different reasons. This approach is called the narrative approach. And it is supported by supported by myself and some of my colleagues in the St. Petersburg University. And it shows that a person at two different moments in time should be viewed as two rooms of the same house. Basically, they're not the same, but they relate to each other as parts relate to the whole. In other words, humans have not only spatial parts, or not humans, persons, that's important. Persons not only have spatial parts, I have my spatial parts, but I also have temporal parts. So these temporal parts are connected by a narrative. It's a very loose connection. And the narrative is a story about some agent, his actions and motives, presented in consequential order. It is the story that explains previous events and consequent events and justified by the agent goals, values, and priorities. I'm actually saying that this story is a fiction. It's something we write every day about us. It's like after autobiography. We write it every day. We add some more pages to it. But it's a very loose. We can write one way or another. But I think that that's the best relation we can get. That's the best thing we can actually hope for. So the narrative approach can be traced back to analytic tradition and continental tradition, but also can be tracked back to some of the ideas mentioned by two important scientists, Luria and Vygotsky, and their principle of extracortical organization of complex mental functions. Their concept implies that mental functions, higher mental functions, are often formed by support of external auxiliary tools, like pen and paper. And maybe it will be a slight extension on their view if I would say that autobiographical narrative that we compose in many, many ways is part of that, is that kind of tool. So it creates the self as a useful illusion and connects self across moments in time. So how does it solve the puzzle cases I described before? Well, first, it denies the requirement of numerical identity for survival and responsibility. It also denies the necessity of having only one successor. So in fact, I do believe that I can be in multiple places, some years later. So there could be multiple successors. And according to the narrative approach, person persists if his narrative persists and it integrates new parts. It also implies that a person as a unified numerical agent persisting in time is a fiction. But it is a useful fiction, which helps us to interpret and predict a behavior of a human. So what is my conclusion? I talked about personal identity. I explained what is the problem of personal identity in modern analytic Russian philosophy. And I've also explained the three main approaches. I think I have shown that these approaches were wrong based on the thought experiments that also that justify it. And I explained the fourth alternative to the philosophical riddle, that is a narrative approach. This approach can be grounded in the ideas of Russian scientists, and it avoids some of the philosophical puzzles. Thank you.
About self. I think over 3,000 years, people gradually develop interest or curiosity. And then now, those theories or philosophy or concept of creator, this spirit life created by God. So, in the West, they call soul created by God. So quite simple. No need much complication. Ask God. Then, you see the ancient Indian sort of concept, life after life. Life more or less natural. No creation, creator. So then, the Buddhist question, previous life come this life, from this life, next life. So body, mind which is related to this body, obviously not come from previous life and will not go next life. So they develop a concept of Atma, which is completely separate from this body.
Independent, yeah.
Independent.
So in Tibetan, we actually explain this, talking about the non-Buddhist. Yeah, in the kind of Indian text, this particular Atman or soul or eternal principle of the self is characterized as being eternal or permanent, unchanging, and unitary and independent. So three main attributes of this.
Oh. So then, Buddha come. Buddha say, no. Kedi phungbu dai na kedi jibu shen du. Kedi phungbu dam le shen, phungbu sen me ba ju sen. Ta di dom jik jön yu san do rang na ro le da ji sha wa du gi sen. Tene da wa ju ba yin. Du ji phungbu di dong des. Ta da ni ye ma yin.
So
ona da chön me ba res la na. Any 지대야나 차노나 때는 식도 줘봐 따라서 지진 풍분남 때문에 구조심 지져베인스.
So Buddha was a descender to this mainstream received view of the notion of self as an eternal, unitary, independent entity, and Buddha rejected the notion and explained that how, in fact, this grasping at self is at the root of all of our problems. And in fact, the notion of self is like the thought of the evil thought. So liberation really is a function of gaining insight into the absence of that. Then the question is raised, in that case, there's no person, what about the sentient beings? And then Buddha gave the metaphor of a chariot. A chariot is made up of parts, and based on the certain configuration of the parts, we give the label chariot, and it performs the functions of a chariot. So in the same way, on the basis of the aggregation of physical and mental processes, the term sentient being or a person is attributed. So that was the Buddha's answer.
So that other theory. 당시 세계에서 다 샤카고 싶으려고도 그 부분을 전시해 다시도 nhau.
So we see that, for example, even from the neuroscientific point of view, if we were to think in terms of what is the self, and if you, kind of engage in that kind of inquiry with the premise that there should be something that is findable, that is somehow has a self-standing identity and independent, then we run into a problem. So even the scientific and the Western philosophical analysis is showing that this assumptions, this premise, looking for some kind of eternal, self-definable self is a problem.
So within the Buddhist school of thought, there are four major schools of thought: Vivasek, Sotandik, Chittamantra, and Madhyamika. 다 마디미가 나로래 타냐도 랑제 셰바도 미시고 니체 다 타냐도 랑제 생에기 다 우모반의 송체기 랑 랑도 참을로게 강사가 sen시 이기 남시간에 셔용결.
So within the four schools of Buddhist, philosophical thought, the Madhyamaka is the most advanced one, and within Madhyamaka there are two main subsets, sub-schools. So most of the Buddhist schools, they settle on a position that personal identity should be based upon some notion of the continuity of mental faculty, the mental consciousness.
So the Madhyamika, the other one, you see, Tanyaду Ranze Mishivati.
So the final school is a Madhyamaka that rejects the notion of something objective, intrinsically real entity, even on a conventional level. They reject that idea at all, completely.
가서 chanzo 계시게 조모죠. 뚜줍 사야지 계시게 조모죠. 당고. 가. 고불루르고 자시는 날이야. 아니 대진저번 중앙강. 대는 동관이듯이. 대는 때는 다고데 tinyu ume lami nos tene takwa induzane tene suzane ngoni jotse tangdase tene taksdu takwa kone yebadi chandase medase sadine indu takje 타인다 저 ume lamde tenjung tekkonani koya 되는 거래스.
So this position is actually very well captured in a passage in Nagarjuna's own text where he talks about how everything that is dependently originated.
가사데 근시견을 기버 대마지 될 계획을 예마이 견을 락래 칸데 동버셔 근시 뚱니시데 박유인스.
So the Nagarjuna's actually on this particular kind of passage is based in turn on a passage from the Buddha's scripture sutra where Buddha talks about how
너 그래 신기해. 너 띵은지 죠.
So it's in a Mahayana sutra. So Nagarjuna says that whatever is dependently originated is empty, and this things that are empty are dependently designated or labeled, and this I call the true middle way. So the notion of dependence rejects anything that involves the idea of some kind of absolute eternal real existence, and then the notion of designation, kind of prevents one from falling into the nihilism, saying that nothing exists. So it's in this way the notion of middle way, that is neither falling into extreme of absolutism or extreme of annihilation, nihilism. Yeah, annihilation.
Now, quantum physics, as far as material thing is concerned, nothing objectively exists. Finally, depend on observer. So long observer there, things there. No longer observer, things not there. That is semzabe.
So this particular kind of insight from the quantum physics.
남들 가래거든. 가래 남의 책을 그래. 책 텐지 미국 예배실 뭐도 달로 샤마이. dit 가리 책을. 남게래. 취지하고요. 저 남게.
So for this particular insight from quantum physics really almost exactly mirrors idea in a Buddhist text by Dharmakirti, the 7th century, epistemologist, where he talks about how the perception of the blue and the content blue are simultaneous. You cannot reduce one to the other.
저는 지dun가니. 셔탐절로 다 수징 셔들이 샘티당 이제스. 수모든 좀 자직사시고 송지 So
this particular standpoint, referred to as the mind-only standpoint, rejects any objectivity to the physical world that we experience. So it's a form of mentalism.
Yes. 다 우모벌 레드잖아요. 섬섬에 따와디 셰지생에게 우모지기 열어라. 우모지기 다 섬섬에 그 치료기다 쳐디디 가다 섬근당 처참체 섬디 된주셔야지. 다 디바까지. 어다간다 치송이네리 난즈베이네리 니가로 아니 때는 딱섬 마도 뭐 주요 말이지.
So the Madhyamaka actually because the Chittamatra, the mind-only school, rejects the notion of objectivity to the external world, but they tend to somehow reify the internal world of experience, the subjective world of mind. But Madhyamaka rejects even that. So, the Madhyamaka doesn't make a distinction in terms of reality between the external world and the internal world of experience, and rejects any notion of objective existence to both.
Now, real question is now, what is use using that kind of theory? just theory. If may I say so, they're scientists. Just a theory. Now, in Buddhism, this theory, you see, use as an antidote of fundamental ignorance. Fundamental ignorance is, you see, we grasping. Right? That tenjingone yebashi nangyungyo, now that tenjingone trouble tetting law or attack in Zimbabwe, tenzin sigyare. That day, young Luduk Shungdi, very several. The Giana Tasha, Tisham Saturday, and Drawayare. Shall Ludu and the Shungdi, lad and yomo sever tar, lad and yomo namdole. Din namdo said, Tenzing namdo membership. Namdo said, Chimi jig namdo. Did send you the bola, take it, Tara shake to Chimi jig namdok, Jordani. Jig, Idon, Shuji don is. Permanent yedevici, 이동만 permanent yedevici 상당인데 그 담바 아택 이동하지. 당연히 이동 명하지 뭐이네 그 유진원에 미도버 담바지 피겠다 나용겨 나왔다 또 주었대 이러잖아요. 아택은 좀 어떻게도 와. 자상가 취미이직 남도기 녀몽지게 하리스. 녀몽게 레서게 하리스. 근데 취미이직 남도디 된지게 잡아려 중하리스. 빼면서 세버리셔. 야오 쉬우지다 돼. 대자들 저번에 동번이 진 가고 있는 줄. 다들 냠좀 싸고래. 동번이 진 거도 가면 누가 나서 동번이 있으니 땅다 치달라고 하는데 꼭 모두 더 섬이야. 뒤고 구조 되기도 합니다. 다들 광고로 와. 다들 뒤중 거 싫어. 섬중 거 싫어. 공중 거 싫어. 냠좀 깨요나. 아니 갈래를 섬을 이거 딴데로 줘야지.
So in the
저 나한테 계시 책임에다 대부분도 싸봐야 대나능에 공부시다. 냠냠 그러지 이해되었을지.
So in the Buddhist context, this is not just theorizing. Actually, this insight into the absence of intrinsic existence of everything is really seen as a powerful insight that counteracts a source of much of our problem. Because the source of much of our problem really lies, according to Buddhist understanding, is in a form of a naive grasping at things as they appear to us. When we, in our naive perception of the world tends to appear as if they're existing out there, real, solid, on its own, without any connection to us. And our emotional reaction follows that kind of perception. And the perception is based on this objective reality, and our emotional response is followed by this. So this is really powerfully captured in one of Nagarjuna's own text, where he talks about how, if you look at the harmful behavior in the 18th chapter of his main treatise on the Middle Way, he says if we examine, much the various negative actions that we engage in, they actually tend to be triggered by certain emotional reactivity. And if you look at the emotional reactivity, they tend to be based on some kind of some element of distortion or falsification of the information that we have about the world. And if that kind of falsification and distortion ultimately is rooted in a grasping at some kind of objective existence. And this grasping can be then eliminated by the insight into emptiness. And that's why this insight into emptiness is seen as a very important point. And His Holiness was therefore telling the monks here, monastic colleagues here, that this is why... Teasing them. This is why we speak of different stages of understanding. The initial stage of understanding based on study and hearsay, and then the second level of understanding, which is really understanding based on critical reflection, something that you yourself organize.
Vipassana, analytical meditation.
Analyze. And then the final third stage of understanding is the experiential understanding. So it is only in this way a real change can take place. So, the monks may use the word emptiness 1,000, 10,000 times, but if it is not internalized, it wouldn't have the effect. So His Holiness was therefore saying that this monk Lama, who talked about how the geshis are an embodiment of colorful words, but when it comes to substance, they're almost empty. So His Holiness is saying that he has always tried to make sure that he doesn't fall into that category of issues.
So now, you see, number of occasions, I sort of, express, of course, scientists. Those scientists or quantum physicists who not only intellectually sort of understand, but truly believe or nothing objectively exists, or they mainly external thing. Such scientists, quantum physicists, who really believe that, then I think their emotion could be less. So recent, Tanizanga distance, Demichigan, Taiwan Mario, Taiwan Demichigan article t-shirts. The Ningduchik Pina Yusuf Tons. Tishadwa, quantum physics, Kazoda, the Kazo, using the two Mavachiki. Didn't Gita Kanda easy singing the Yuji Namsha, touching to somebody, touching to Yabari said, the doors new young doors. Logical doors. That you could tensing the six of them in Dumato, tensing a lot of doors, shook doors. In this session.
His Holiness was saying that he recently read kind of a synopsis of a paper that was originally written in Chinese. He read
I think Taiwanese.
And the paper was about observation made by someone of people who have really taken to heart the insight of quantum physics, and those who have really tried to kind of embody this and think through carefully. His observation was that among those people there seems to be less fixation on a kind of a more fundamentalist ideas of black and white. This must be it. So that kind of rigid grasping seemed to be less.
I think yesterday I briefly mentioned one of my friend, one American, one scientist, very old, now almost 100 years old.
Yeah, he's a cognitive behavior therapy. Aaron Beck, Dr.
Aaron Beck, yes, Aaron Beck. When I first met him, then his age 84. Then my last sort of call on him, then 97. So I was told, you see, he's still alive. So he, few decades, he's sort of also helping those patients who much disturbed their mind due to anger. And he found the angry person, the object which they feel anger, appears something very negative. Actually, 90% of that negativeness is mental projection. That's the
so this point Aaron Beck is raising about how disproportionate percentage of that negative perception is really exaggeration. The projection from the person's mind seems to jive really well with what Nagarjuna is talking about, how at the root of our negative emotions lies this kind of falsification and distortion.
So those scientists, there is no need except next life or heaven or hell. No need moderation. But this very life, you see, in order to develop more peaceful mind, usually the real destroyer of peace of mind is anger, attachment. Anger entirely based on attachment. So these two are real destroyer of our peace of mind. And through that way, eventually destroy our physical health and family happiness and the community's happiness. So just in order to build a happy individual, happy family, happy community, this theory, I feel, some relevant. So we Buddhists, you see, meditate on this theory in order to achieve Buddhahood. So you no need that way thinking. Just how to reduce your raw the emotions. Like that. Thank you.
Your Holiness, thank you very much for sharing.
while
So although we speak of all phenomena having no objective reality and it's all being designations and labels, but when you're hungry, it is real.
So we have a lunch break now. Thank you, all of you, and we meet at 1 o'clock for the next session.
Okay.